Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and welcome to the channel. How does a Gen 6 454, you know, the 7.4 liter, compare to the more modern Gen 7 8.1? Let's find out. In this video, we're going to take a look at a direct comparison between the Gen 6 7.4 liter 454 truck motor and the larger 8.1 liter Gen 7 496. We want to find out how much more power the bigger motor actually makes, and then find out if we can make any modifications to the smaller 7.4 liter to have it make power like the 8.1. Let's check it out. To get this comparison started, we have the Battle of the Junkyard Behemoths, our two big blocks. We're going to start out with our Gen 6 7.4 liter 454. Now, this motor was run in stock trim, as I say. When we run them on the engine dyno, we run them with no accessories, no air inlet system. Both of these motors were run with the same 2¼ inch long tube headers. And there are dyno headers for Westech. And before you jump in and say, oh, you need to run 1 3/4 inch and 7/8 headers on these low power versions, please know that we had tried smaller headers on both of these, and it showed very little power gain. We went from these 2¼ inch headers down to 2-inch headers, and we didn't see very much of a change in power. That's not to say that with an even smaller set, we might not see something. We're just not going to see the 30, 40, 50 horsepower that some guys can't claim will be the result of running a smaller header on this combination. So for our Gen 6 454, as a comparison to the previous Gen 5, the Gen 6 had a better cylinder head. It had a smaller combustion chamber. Ours measured 102 cc's. It also had a larger opening where the previous Gen 5 stuff used peanut port heads. The Gen 6 actually used a standard size oval port. So the head flow was better than the peanut port and a smaller chamber. This motor had slightly higher compression than the previous Gen 5. Also, the Gen 6 featured factory hydraulic roller valve train, whereas the previous Gen 5 stuff had flat tapped camshafts. The Gen 6 also had a individual port injected long runner-ish EFI manifold, where the Gen 5 stuff had throttle body injection. So the Gen 6 was a better motor than the Gen 5 and was rated about 50 horsepower better. The factory rating was 290 horsepower for this Gen 6 version. So we also, the other change that we made, two other changes that we made before we ran this thing on the dyno is, one, we replaced the factory distributor that comes in the Gen 6 motor. We replaced that because it was dedicated for the factory EFI. We just put a simple MSD locked distributor in and ran that with the Holley HP management system. We also took out the factory fuel injectors out of the EFI setup, ran them on the ASNU machine just to make sure that they worked, and then to make sure that they were all even. We ran about 60 pounds of fuel pressure on the setup and then tuned it with a Holley HP management system. And this is what we came up with. Run on the engine dyno in the trim I just described, the 7.4 liter, the Gen 6 454, produced 356 horsepower. And peak torque checked in at 485.5, so 486 foot-pounds. So now let's see how this compares to the Gen 7 8.1 liter or 496. So here is our Gen 7 run in the same manner. The exact same headers, had the same Holley HP management system. We ran this because the Gen 7 didn't have a distributor. We could run it. It basically came with a 24X LS-based crank trigger, so we ran it just with an LS harness and ran this with a set of bigger injectors because later on we would be running a turbo on the 8.1. And here is the difference between a 454 and a 496. The Gen 6 also had a hydraulic roller cam. It had cylinder heads that were different than the Gen 6 because their symmetrical port, they look like LS cathedral port heads, kind of. The 8.1 also had a, I think, much longer runner, cross ram style, LS style intake manifold. As I said, we ran the same throttle body, the same headers on it, and optimized the tune. But run in this manner, the 8.1 liter produced 423 horsepower. And peak torque checked in at 554 foot-pounds. And as you can see, the bigger motor basically made more power everywhere compared, the 8.1 was better everywhere compared to the 7.4 liter. So that's not surprising. A bigger motor is going to make more low speed power. Basically, it made more power everywhere. It's bigger, has enough head flow to support this power level, and enough cam timing for this thing to make power. I mean, they both made peak power fairly low. The 7.4 liter made it here at 4,400, and that's about where the and that's exactly where the bigger 8.1 liter also made peak power. So now let's take a look at what happens when we modify at least the 7.4 and find out if we could push it closer to the power output of the 8.1. We've taken a look at a comparison between the Gen 6 7.4 liter 454 and the Gen 7 8.1 liter 496 in stock trim. Now let's see if we can upgrade the 454 to at least have it make as much horsepower, if not as much torque, as the larger 8.1 liter. So this is our Gen 6 454 run in basically stock trim with long tube headers, the MSD and Holley HP the way we described it previously. We were at 356 horsepower and 386 foot-pounds of torque. Here's what happened when we did our first modification to the 454. We basically added a carbureted induction system. So we put a carburetor and intake manifold in place of the factory EFI setup. In this case, we ran a Performer RPM air gap dual plane intake manifold, which is the ideal choice for this combination, and a 650 Holley carburetor. And I know, big block guy, 650 is not big enough. This is a big block, Richard. Yes, but it's only a 370 horsepower big block. So a 650 actually is sized kind of perfectly for this application. But run with the carburetor, the peak power went up to 370 horsepower, although peak torque was down to 476 foot-pounds of torque. Made a little bit less power down low than the long runner EFI manifold, but certainly more power from 3,700 on out. But the real change in power with the Gen 6 Junkyard 454 came when we installed a camshaft. So here's the camshaft that we installed in this thing. This was an Extreme Energy 276 cam from Comp Cams. And that camshaft was 510 lift. It was a 224, 230 degree duration split and 113 degree lobe separation angle. Naturally, we also changed the valve spring package because the stock valve springs were not enough for that camshaft. But as you can see, that made a big difference in both peak horsepower and torque. In fact, peak power was up to 428 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 515 foot-pounds of torque. So that's our modified version of the Gen 6 454. So now let's see how that compares to our otherwise stock 8.1 liter, because unfortunately I haven't run an aftermarket camshaft in the 8.1 liter yet, but that will be coming. So here is our stock 8.1 liter, and as you can see, the 454 is still not up to the torque production of the bigger motor, and again, that's not surprising. That 8.1 liter was designed by GM to make lots and lots of torque. It's used in motorhome applications and industrial, agricultural generators and all kinds of stuff. So it's a big motor, and it's a very big efficient motor and makes a lot of average power production. And as you can see, it's still making quite a bit more torque. 515 for the modified 454, but 554 foot-pounds for the stock Gen 6 or Gen 7 8.1 liter. One thing we do see is that the peak numbers in terms of horsepower are very similar now. We have 424 for the 8.1 and 428 for the cammed 7.4 liter 454. But they are making peak power at different engine speeds now. Now with the 454, the cammed one, it's making peak power out at 5,100, and that compares to about 4,400 for the 8.1 liter. So it is making more power. It's making more power out at a higher RPM, but still just cannot make the low speed torque offered by the bigger 8.1 liter. But that's what happens. Sometimes bigger really is better. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn in this direct comparison between our two Junkyard motors, the 7.4 liter Gen 6 454 and the 8.1 liter Gen 7 496? Well, I think we learned the following thing. When it comes to making really low speed torque production, like for towing applications in big serious trucks, there's no replacement for displacement. And the 8.1 showed that, making more power and especially more low speed power than the smaller 454. but we were able to reach the same peak power output with basically just putting a camshaft in the 454. Now that's actually fairly easy. All it took was a little bit of cam timing, and all of a sudden the smaller 7.4 liter 454 made as much peak power anyway as the Gen 7 8.1 liter, but it did not make the same peak torque. The torque went up, but it didn't ever reach the power output or the torque output of the larger 8.1 liter. Now, in fact, we could also do that with an even smaller 6 liter LS, for instance. If we had a cam 6 liter, we could easily produce that same kind of peak power number. But once again, like with the 454, we would never get the low speed torque production offered by the 8.1. There is one way to do that, obviously, and that's with boost. If we had a very small responsive turbo and we can have it spool up immediately, and if you want to take a look at the video that I put up where we actually turbocharge the 8.1 liter, if you want to see lots and lots of low speed torque, we could do the same thing with the Gen 6 454 or even a 6 liter LS and have it produce a lot of torque down there with boost. So maybe there is a replacement for displacement, and that would be forced induction. If you want to get lots and lots of towing power, obviously bigger is better. Now all we have to do is add a camshaft or something, heads, intake manifold to the 8.1, and have it make even more power. Armature holder, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I will keep testing.